Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Albert Park. Albert is the Bank of America Associate Professor of Pacific Basin Studies at Claremont McKenna College, a historian of modern Korea and East Asia, and importantly for this podcast, an expert on the growth of religion and specifically Protestantism in early and modern Korea. During the Goryeo dynasty, Korea was dominated by Buddhism, but through a weakening of the state and the collapsing of certain finances and the ability to protect themselves, as the Joseon dynasty came around, the country also turned towards Neo-Confucianism. As the new ruling philosophy of the state, the idea was that this would strengthen the country in the way that Buddhism never managed to. This was more hierarchical and drilled more deeply into the need for discipline and strength. But Buddhism was never wiped out. It was seen as heretical at the time, something heterodox, something that needed to be challenged and pushed to the margins, but it never was completely wiped out, despite the purges at the time. And yet alongside this, Shamanism survived, and didn't suffer the same kind of wrath that Buddhism did. This was a multivariant way in which people celebrated their ancestors, and the rituals through which this came about. Daoism was there as well, as was Catholicism. Even before the first missionary arrived in Korea, there were already 4,000 followers. The reason for this was that this Western religion was offering something that hadn't been offered before. A way to explain the world around them, explain the suffering in the daily lives of individuals, and offer hope for people who felt abandoned through the breakdown of the Confucian hierarchy and the benefits that were meant to flow from the upper classes to the lower classes. However, there were persecutions of Catholicism at the time, 1801, 1815, 1846, 1866, but yet it was never wiped out, largely for that same reason. It offered something that was needed by the people and wasn't already being offered. Korea was a weakening society at the time, a change in society. It had already witnessed gunboat diplomacy from Japan, been forced to open its borders, and modernity was knocking at its door. Capitalism was creeping in, and Koreans were increasingly aware that they had to change. Not just that modernity was a risk to their way of life, but it was something they would have to embrace if they ever wanted to compete with the big powers in the world and remain an independent country. And so it would make sense that the religion of the West, the religion of the powerful, would have a role in this. Which winds us forward to Tonghak, loosely translated to Eastern learning. This was an almost pantheistic religion that embodied the best parts of those which had come before it. It took parts of Catholicism and Confucianism, and through this tried to focus on the needs of the people, try to satisfy what everyone needed inside society. And from Buddhism it took benevolence, the generosity, and the universality. From Daoism it appropriated the idea and the focus on ethics and human relations, and the internal spirit. The idea that human beings can connect with a higher reality, an ultimate reality. And through this, Tonghak was widely successful at the time, until the rebellion in the late 19th century. We're trying to fight for religious freedom against the forces of Japanese imperialism. The movement was effectively crushed. And so it was about this time that King Koyeong looked towards Protestantism in the broader world, a faith that seemingly could bring with it modernization, Western medicine, Western technology, and Western education, the means through which Korea could become a powerful nation in its own right. And importantly, with this also came capitalism, a redefining of how people saw themselves, their work, and their relationship with money. It was vitally important for these early Christian churches to become independent and self-sustaining. They would only be able to rely upon the donations of their own parishioners. And slowly through this, Koreans learned to be capitalists, learned a Protestant work ethic, the idea of saving money, the idea of investing money, and finally breaking free from the old feudal order. They saw the value in their own labor and demanded that value be represented monetarily. And of course, soon this became more. Originally, it was just the way in which individual churches could grow and put down solid roots inside the community. But of course, this was also a mechanism which Christianity could grow inside Korea. A way in which these early missionaries could mold the country into a Christian nation. And a huge part of this podcast is going to be a focus on just that. The way in which early Protestantism changed the dynamics of Korea forever. The impact it's had on not just the economy, but the society and the religious landscape. And how that still lingers today on the Korean peninsula. But from here out, I'll let Albert tell the story. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can simply share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. All the help is greatly appreciated. On that, and to walk us through the history of religion, the rise of Protestantism, and its impact on Korean society, this is Albert Park. Albert Park, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to speak about Christianity and its early development inside South Korea and North Korea for that matter, and its impact on capitalism. But I suppose as a first question, we should go back and do a little bit of history, not just because it builds into Christianity, but because some of the changes happening at this period also become apparent once Christianity begins to grow as well. So let's go back pre-1876 and to some of the religions that were on the ground at the time. So let's start with Buddhism as an early faith at the time.
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, before the arrival of Christianity in the late 19th century, there were many religions, or particularly Buddhism, as you mentioned, and of course that Buddhism really thrived on the Korean Peninsula during the Goryeo period, right before the Joseon period, where it was considered a state religion, and because of its association with the government or the state at the time, they had a lot of resources and a lot of support. So you saw the, great diffusion of Buddhism at that time period. But in addition to Buddhism, of course, you had shamanism, which one could say is the indigenous religion of Korea. And shamanism, which is basically a system of belief that says that the world is endowed and created by various types of spirits. So you have water spirits, you have land spirits, mountain spirits, and so forth. These spirits are figures that you communicate with and that you honor and you worship. And if anything happens in your life that you need some type of protection, let's say you're going out into the sea, then you call on the particular spirit for help and guidance. And the person or the figure who helps you to communicate with that spirit, of course, is called the shaman. And the shaman within Korean history has always been female, and that's a tradition passed on from female to female. One could say that Buddhism was the organized religion because it was supported by the state, where you had a clear system of belief, where it involved hierarchy, where you had leaders and followers. And then shamanism is more of a decentralized or unorganized religion, unorganized in the sense of decentralized, where there is no central area that rules over or governs the religion, like you would have, let's just say, the Catholic Church today. So those are two of the main religions. Of course, you had Confucianism, which is up to debate, depending on how you define religion. It would be considered religion or philosophy, but that, of course, becomes the main, system of belief that the Joseon government adopts, and that's mostly for governance. They turn to Confucianism as a way to think about how do we rule over society, how do we govern society, how do we create the ideal society, and so forth. And that, of course, informed all of the major rules, laws, institutions, customs in Joseon Korea. Go ahead. Sorry.
Let's move forward and talk about Confucianism then, or perhaps Neo-Confucianism at the time.
Sure.
And let's talk about its import and what it did to those previous two religions you mentioned, the shamanism and Buddhism. So when Neo-Confucianism becomes the state faith or state religion or just philosophy, as you're mentioning there, it takes quite a hostile look towards Buddhism and a less hostile glance towards shamanism. So I might get you to explain those two looks as well, just because it will have some import for how Christianity becomes apparent later on.
Sure, of course, yeah. That's a great question. When the Joseon government, Joseon society emerges, you have immediately the clamping down of Buddhism. And when I mean the clamping down, particularly the disassociation between religion and state, where no longer the Joseon state actively supports and officially supports Buddhism. So that means not necessarily giving them free land, providing any types of subsidies, and so forth. that doesn't necessarily mean then they destroyed Buddhism, because temples still continue to operate, and followers, of course, were continued to be allowed to practice Buddhism. So in the Buddhist case, it's more just a dissociation from the state. In terms of shamanism is, because it's unorganized, or it's not this organized religion, the chosen state never, and subsequent other governments never really found it a clear threat. Perhaps the only time that shamanism was considered a threat was by the Japanese, perhaps in the 1920s and 1930s, by the colonial government. But until then, it wasn't considered much of a threat. It wasn't a competing kind of system belief to Confucianism. In fact, many people argue that it can be the shamanism and Confucian can coincide with one another. And that's what basically during the Chosen period, everyone had some type of allegiance or in one religion or multiple religions. They could be Confucian, they could be Buddhist, and they could be shaman, all at the same time. Although they might identify themselves as Buddhist, still they practice multiple religions.
And in the 18th century, the Joseon dynasty began to enter a period of, I suppose, flux, or perhaps just instability. And this has considerable ramifications, not just for those previous philosophies and previous religions, but this is also a period when Catholicism begins to emerge, at least in an organized way, on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, exactly. At the time, particularly, as you mentioned, 18th century, going into the 19th century, when there's these changes happening on the Korean Peninsula. For example, you start to see changes within the economy, the everyday economy, where, let's say, people are producing a bit more for the market. They're not just living a life of self-subsistence, which then causes a chain reaction, of course. So many people argue this is kind of the time when you're seeing capitalism emerging, although full-fledged capitalism comes at a later time period. So all these changes are happening. We're also, one key changes, of course, is Yangban, the landed elite, who are expected to uphold Confucian principles and be the guardians of the state at the local level. We're not really practicing or upholding certain types of customs and traditions. Many of them also fell into debt. So what you're starting to see, as I like to argue, is this disjuncture between what is and what it should be. So what should be is the ideal Confucian society where Yangban are leading, people under them are following, and so forth, and all the rules and customs and practices of Confucian being followed out. But in reality, what was completely opposite, where you're having people lower than the Yangban becoming more successful or more wealthy, or and all these other changes happening that are threatening the Confucian system. So it's in this kind of disjuncture between what is and what should be, where you find this opening where people are wondering, well, what does society really look like? How is it going to operate? Confucianism is not really explaining all these changes. And it's at that moment that you start seeing people turning to new religions. And that one new religion, because as you mentioned, is Catholicism, where they start to see that Catholicism gives them explanations perhaps about what's happening. But more importantly, it gives them concepts of new identity, how they should act in society, how they should act with one another, how they should conceive of the social and so forth. So Catholicism during the 17th century and even into the 18th century becomes very popular in explaining changes to people and giving them orientation.
And those early days of Catholic influence on the peninsula, of course, this seems to have come first from a from China, as so much did come to Korea through China, at least the missionaries did. How did the Joseon dynasty, even as it was beginning to break up and struggle and have this instability, did it respond to the mass arrival, or at least the mass influence of Catholicism on the peninsula? Because reading through your research here, there was a number of persecution campaigns. Now, not successful, of course, but they go from 1801, 1815, 1846, 1866. So in some ways, the Joseon dynasty did see this as a significant threat.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, there's all these influences of Catholicism, particularly from China, and as it becomes popular amongst commoners, especially because of Catholicism's ideas about the individual as somewhat sacred in relation to a God, and so they had kind of a sacred identity, which Confucianism really does not necessarily emphasize. So as it becomes very popular amongst individuals and they start turning to Catholicism, and of course, Catholicism is a Western religion, the state starts seeing it as a threat because it's taking them away from Confucianism or practicing Confucianism. And one particular example is, Catholicism says that you shouldn't make any idols. And of course, at the time, Koreans practiced various types of ancestry worship. Catholicism considered some of those types of practices as idol worship. And so there was, at some point, calls for Catholics in Korea not to practice those ancestry worship, which of course then threatened the Confucian order, because Confucianism was based on traditions of following these practices. And what ended up happening is the Joseon state found this as an existential threat. If people are not going to follow these practices, Confucian practices, and instead just turn to Catholicism, we need to stamp them out. And they of course at that time felt very vulnerable, because the central state was always very weak, and they were very weak during the 17th and 18th century. And they saw that there was a crisis, and things were crumbling in some sense, and Catholicism was in some ways kind of encouraging or kind of influencing that crumbling of society. So as you mentioned, there's these various types of persecution campaigns. And the last persecution campaign up until the 19th century was successful in the end in wiping out Catholicism on the ground, per se, where you don't necessarily have Catholic missionaries, you don't have any type of organized Catholic following. So they were successful at that, but it took time for them, of course, to stamp it out.
And you touched on it then, that this was seen as a Western religion, and this has some value for what your research has and what it explains here. So at this time, there's also a pressure inside not just Korea, but the whole world to modernize. Korea has been in contact with Japan through Japan's own gunboat diplomacy here. And they is a country that, as you said as well, is starting to, some of the old order is beginning to break down. It's not functioning the way it should, but they also begin to recognize that the world is changing rapidly around them, and in some ways they have to change as well. So I wonder what this impact has when a new religion comes from the West, a group of countries that already seem developed in this way. So did this have some value or some import, that this was the faith of the modernized world?
I think not necessarily Catholicism, but more, of course, Protestant Christianity, where you start seeing the late 19th century, this connection between Protestant Christianity and modernization, or Western-based modernization. At the time, of course, as you mentioned, in the 19th century, where Confucianism is weakening, and for many people, it no longer has the value of explaining things in public and explaining all these changes. Then you have all of a sudden all these types of new systems of belief that kind of fill that vacuum. And Protestant Christianity arrives in the late 19th century in the 1880s, and immediately comes and, of course, at first, not openly accepted. They're allowed to arrive, Protestant, Presbyterian, and Methodist missionaries, and they are not necessarily allowed to proselytize. But what they start doing ultimately time is to start schools, Western-based schools, hospitals, offering social services, and introducing a lot of Western concepts, beliefs, and practices, which then, in the eyes of Koreans, means that Christian missionaries are introducing modern techniques, modern beliefs, modern philosophies, modern practices, and modern institutions. And what ends up happening in various types of Koreans, especially like a figure like Yoon Chi-ho or even someone like Sigmund Rhee, is that they start thinking, well, look, if countries in the West, like the United States and Europe, how did they develop? Well, they developed materially, but there had to have been some type of spirit behind it. There had to have been some type of belief behind it that allowed them to progress and become modern. And many of Koreans thought, well, it was because they were Christian. So what you end up happening when Christianity arrives, they see certainly the introduction of all of these new outside practices, institutions, and systems, but they also, which convince them, which tells them that Christianity can help modernize a country. But they also look at the history and say, look, the West became modern because they're Christian. So hence we should also be Christian. So you have all these things happening in the late 19th century that certainly connect Protestant Christianity to modernization.
So let's talk about a fascinating part of the history of Korean religion here. And this is Tonghak. Now, this is from what I can grasp, what you've been saying there as well, it grows out of the idea and this challenge that Confucianism is no longer animating people's lives, or at least not providing the things for people that they expect, or at least that it promises. And Tonghak emerges, and it, at least from my understanding, is a blend or a mixture between Catholicism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, effectively taking the best elements from each one and blending together into this unique form of religion.
Yeah, Tonghak is absolutely a fascinating religion because, as you mentioned, it does blend all of these traditional religious beliefs in Korea at the time, from shamanism to Buddhism. It also incorporates aspects of Confucianism. Some people also argue it incorporates also some aspects of Catholicism. And it becomes this kind of religion with multiple identities. And it grows particularly in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s because of, one, its belief that everyone is sacred. In other words, everyone has this life force that is sacred. Everyone consumes this life force. This life force makes up everyone. It makes up their identity. And this life force is within everyone. It's just not within the elites. It's just not within the government officials. It's not with just the people high on the social hierarchy, on the Confucian social hierarchy. It's everyone. Everyone shares this life force. So hence everyone is sacred. So that, of course, does something to people's identity, where they start seeing themselves as sacred. So that's one. It's very attractive for its beliefs, but it's also grows very popular because of its organization. And Tonghak had a very strong form of organizing its followers, where they had a kind of, not maybe it's, you can equated to somewhat like the Catholic system, where they had this systems of churches and religious leaders and so forth, and it's somewhat of a hierarchy too, in which the top would influence the bottom. But it was this magnificent organized religion that spread rapidly throughout the countryside. So by the 1890s, when the Tonghak Rebellion or Revolution happens, it's depending on, some people call it rebellion, some people call it revolution. By that time, it's unsurprising that Tonghak has this force because of its system of belief and its way of organizing and spreading its beliefs throughout society.
And at the end of that rebellion, what happened to the religion? Because it seems at the time there was a lot of bleeding of people from that faith into a different faith, Changsangyo. And so what happened to the Tonghak faith at this time? Did it survive in any way? Or was the crushing of that rebellion a real significant blow for that particular faith?
Right. So after the Tonghak Rebellion is put down in the later the 1890s, the leaders of Tonghak, some of them are executed, and then what ends up happening is in 1905, Tonghak changes its name from Tonghak to Chondogyo, religion of the heavenly way. And Chondogyo, in fact, grows during the 1910s and throughout the colonial period. In fact, Chondogyo becomes one of the most significant intellectual forces during the 1920s and 1930s, especially because Chondogyo has such a powerful publication arm. Many scholars know this already, but Chondogyo was the main force that produced some journals like Kaebyuk, which was considered the leading intellectual journal in the 1920s and 1930s. But in addition to Kaebyuk, they also produced multiple journals on children, family, on society, and so forth. Again, largely due to their strong way of organizing the religion. So that's something that carried over from Tonghak to Chondogyo. So Chondogyo becomes very influential in spreading modern concepts, modern ideas, particularly asking this question, what does it mean to be modern? What does it mean to be modern for Koreans? And how should a modern Korea look like under Japan and after colonialism? What ends up happening is, and I don't want to go throughout the whole history of Tonghak Chondogyo, but after 1945, the influence of Chondogyo decreases, and of course, there's still a Chondogyo religion in Korea, not as strong as during the colonial period, but Tonghak, the concepts of Tonghak, and particularly the actions of the Tonghak leaders in the 1890s become very influential during the 1970s and 1980s, and even today, where people are turn to the philosophies to resist authoritarianism, use the symbols of these farmers in the 1890s to talk about how we should resist Chondowan and Notaeul or Park Chung-hee and so forth, particularly when farmers in the 1970s and 1980s talked about going up against the authoritarian government. So Tonghak in many ways becomes the symbol of resistance in the 70s, 80s. And I would say, interestingly enough, this is something I'm working on right now because I'm looking at the origins of environmental movements in modern Korea. A lot of people who I consider environmentalists turn to Tonghak and Tonghak philosophy to develop new environmental philosophies, because Tonghak ultimately believes that everyone is one and the same, and that includes other species. So it becomes very, very attractive to environmentalists in Korea today.
So let's bring Christianity, or at least Protestantism, into the picture here. Now, this is 1884 and the arrival of Horace Allen on the peninsula. And now, of course, as we mentioned earlier, Catholicism has been on the peninsula for quite a while at this point. But at the time that Protestantism arrives is, as you said before, a time where Koreans are looking to make sense of the changing world around them, and this fits in a certain way. But it is also supported quite heavily by King Koyong at the time as well. He sees the missionaries as a way in which he can modernize his country quite rapidly with Western medicine, technology, and education in this way. So I might get you to just talk about that very early introduction, and then we'll build out the picture of Protestant faith on the peninsula.
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, with the arrival of Protestant Christianity with Horace Allen, and then later Horace Underwood, Henry Appenzeller, and various groups, and it wasn't just Americans, it was Canadians, Australians, many groups from outside of Korea were coming into the peninsula. You're right, you mentioned that Kojong turned to them in some ways and saw them as valuable resources for learning about Western reforms. That not only included Western science and technology, but also concepts of government, of course, and other philosophies from the West. So there was strong support later on. Now, this happens later on. Originally, when they come, as I mentioned, they're not allowed to proselytize. They're not allowed to go outside of Seoul and try to convert people. In large part, they worry that Christians will be attacked by particularly Tonghak followers and so forth. So later on in the 1890s, when they allow them to proselytize throughout the peninsula. What Kojong does, I think, appreciate, and what Korean statesmen and intellectuals appreciate about the Protestant Christian missionaries is they set up also educational facilities. So Ihwa, which is Ihwa University, was first started as a women's school for young children. You also had Severance Hospital, which is part of Yonsei University today, which is considered the first modern hospital in Korea, and it was founded after Severance, who was a wealthy industrialite in Cleveland, donated money to missionaries to set up this hospital. So Severance becomes the main way to introduce modern medicine from the West. So there's these tangible material benefits that they certainly see from missionaries. And in some ways, missionaries become advisors to Kojong about, how should you transform society? How should you modernize society? How should you become like the United States? So they're very attractive to government officials. But of course, not all government officials. Some are very suspicious of Protestant Christianity because it's also, in many people, is a vehicle for imperialism. And so they look at great suspicion at the missionaries too. So there's all these diverse thinkings about missionaries, but you definitely see tangible benefits according to the government officials.
And at this time, there is a significant theological aspect that I suppose Christianity in general offers here that seem to have a significant impact on people's lives. So I might go to the moment, the Pyongyang revival in 1907, and it seems in the early stages, I'll get you to explain that, of course, but in the early stages of this particular sit-in, this particular movement, it seemed to have struggled. And then after a small period, they hit on something that became very significant for the growth of Protestantism inside South Korea and North Korea here. And that is this idea of sin. And suddenly Koreans were looking at the world around them, their pain and suffering that they felt from laboring under Confucianism or Buddhism or whatever it may be. And suddenly they were making a connection that sin was the problem in their lives. Sin was the reason for their suffering. And this had a huge impact on the growth of the faith.
Yeah, certainly. By the early 1900s, according to missionaries, they felt like there was this kind of spiritual malaise in Korea. And this is based on their writings. And when you read the writings, they talk about, Koreans seem to be in the malaise, but more importantly, they're very concerned about all the things happening around them, of course. Japan threatening to colonize them. The United States treating them like a pawn in the international game. All these Western powers and Russia having their eyes on Korea. So the sovereignty of Korea is being threatened. So there's this kind of malaise, but also this anxiety. And so the missionaries, Protestant missionaries, are thinking of ways of, well, how do we spiritually address this malaise and anxieties? And so around 1906, 1907, you start to have these types of revival, big revival, where it features speakers and a lot of praying, collectively speaking. And in Pyongyang, which at the time was growing into the one could say the capital of Protestant Christianity, particularly around the work and efforts of Presbyterians, American Presbyterians, you start to see these revival meetings starting. And as you mentioned, what ends up happening is the missionaries start to notice is that people are crying out and wailing out while they're praying. And a lot of them start to say, well, I feel this way, or we're in this position because of sin. We are being punished because of sin. We are being colonized because we're sinful. And so what I would argue is that sin becomes a symbol to start explaining their position, to explain their problems, to explain why they've come to this point where they are full of anxiety and why all these countries are threatening to take away Korea's sovereignty. And so sin becomes a symbol, becomes a language through which they could start pinpointing and addressing the cause of their problems. And so if they can then pinpoint the cause of their problem, meaning sin, then there's a way to address it and overcome it. Well, then you have to convert and then believe in Jesus Christ as your Savior and follow the practices of Protestant churches. So the Pyongyang revival and meetings subsequently after the Pyongyang revival become these mechanisms for to address the concerns, the anxiety, the malaise of people, to provide them with the language to help them understand the problems around them. So very much so, I would say sin is the real symbol to explain everything that's going on in their lives.
And another significant symbol here is one, I suppose, that people are quite familiar with from the Protestant faith around the world, and that is the idea of the Protestant work ethic. And at this time, and this would be quite a significant divergence here because there's a lot of detail in this particular part of your research. Mm-hmm. This is the rise of capitalism inside South Korea, and its influence directly from these Protestant churches and these missionaries themselves. So I might get to open up the idea here of this rise of capitalism, but I might get to do so perhaps through the rise of the industrial education departments, these IEDs at the time.
Sure. Yeah, so we don't have enough time to go through explain the entire history of capitalism on the Korean Peninsula, but as I mentioned earlier, scholars have, at least in Korea, have pinpointed the around the 18th century as a time when you start to see elements of capitalism. Now, by the 19th century, when missionaries are entering into Korea, Protestant missionaries, they bring with them these ideas of capitalism, I would argue. Many of them themselves are indoctrinated and conditioned by capitalism within their own countries, coming from the United States and England and so forth. And so when they arrive, they think that the form in which Korea could become modern is through industrial capitalism. Why? Well, look at our own countries. Look how well we have done, how we have succeeded through this combination between Christianity and industrial capitalism. So they come and they are thinking about, well, how do we cultivate kind of the values of capitalism, the logic of capitalism? How do we cultivate capitalism? Maybe through a spiritual lens, of course. And they think of the various mechanisms, and one of them is industrial education departments, which are these departments in the missionary schools where they teach them about the principles about the market and how the market works, how to sell, how to buy, how to trade, how to make a profit. They learn about industrialites, famous industrialites from the United States who are successful. In addition to learning in the classroom about capitalism, then they should practice it through these little factories that they set up, where they start producing and manufacturing, let's say, shoes, furniture, various other types of items that are eventually sold to the general public in Korea. But the whole point of it is not so that these kind of vocational training kind of programs are so that they can sell the products. It's more so that Koreans will be conditioned intellectually, mentally, so the mind, but also through the body, that they'll learn about what does the process of capitalism incorporate. How do you experience it? So they become quite popular throughout the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And the belief is that, well, if Koreans can learn about capitalism, then they will become prosperous. They will not only become materially prosperous, but they will also become spiritually prosperous. So they're very much focused on building these schools within industrial education departments within the missionary educational system.
And that idea of changing one's relationship with capital and I suppose money itself is I suppose a fundamental philosophy here that really grows through the faith and changes it dramatically. So I might get to introduce the Nevis plan here, but it's got some real huge impacts for the growth of the faith inside Korea at the time, because it requires that each church becomes self-sustaining effectively. It changes the relationship of the average Korean with how they've seen work and capital. So instead of looking at the world in terms of you are serving a landlord or working under a Confucian hierarchy, now you have values of diligence, hard work, thrift, saving, and all these sorts of things here. So let's open up the Nevis plan, because this is a tour that Nevis does through South Korea and North Korea, of course, for just 2 weeks. But it has a huge impact on the growth of Protestant Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. It is. The Nevis plan is very much a significant kind of force in the history of Protestant Christianity, where this plan basically exhorted churches to become self-sufficient. So Nevis explained that in order for churches to survive, they have to be self-sufficient. And this was a principle that needed to be implemented outside of the West in areas that were being proselytized by missionaries, because there's either you can, as a missionary, give a lot of resources of support, but in their eyes that creates a level of dependency. And if the missionary leaves, then possibly the church will fail. Because they were so dependent on the missionaries. But if you create a self-sufficient church, then when the missionary leaves, then the church will continue to run without the presence or the support of the missionary. And so Koreans adopted the Nevis plan, missionaries, adopted this plan and implemented it throughout the peninsula. And what I would argue when I started doing the research is, well, especially if you look at the writings by church officials, Koreans, and so forth, you start to see that many of them look at money in a very different way, where money is important, making money is important, first of all. That's the first principle. You should make money, but the money should be used to make the church self-sufficient. And so what I argued in one of my essays is that money should be considered some type of spiritual productive capital, where it will be made and then given to the church so that it could be self-sufficient. And so what ends up happening is that this type of belief that money has a spiritual productive capital starts influencing, I would argue, just the economic behavior of many Korean Christians, who then go off to start factories, go off to start various types of commercial enterprises, where they see that their businesses are just not these secular businesses, but these are businesses that have spiritual value, that have sacred value, because it's producing all of this spiritual productive capital. The interesting thing is, if you look at capitalism, history of capitalism, especially in relation to religion, there's always this type of anxiety about making money. So followers often talk about, oh, I'm very anxious about making all this money because money could make me materialistic, could control me, and so forth. But what ends up happening is that within the Protestant church, it kind of helps dispel and tries to dispel any of that anxiety about money, because they're saying, well, you can make money, don't worry, that money will be used for spiritual good. It's not going to be made so that you could live wealthy and prosperous lives. You won't be controlled by it. You will control it so that it can be used to spread the gospel of God and Jesus and so forth. So I would argue that, you know, the Nevius plan certainly helps to create a system of producing spiritual capital, productive capital, and relieving the anxiety about making money.
And I would have to assume at the time, rather than just being self-sustaining, so protecting the church from outside shocks or changes or the loss of missionary support, it would also have a significant impact on a desire to make Korea a Christian nation, for example, the idea of spreading the faith throughout the peninsula itself. And this also, as you just mentioned at the end there, it was clicking in my mind, one is once again changing the idea about having money and capital and removing the stigma of sorts. It must have had a huge impact on the conversion or the entry to the faith from people like merchants or landowners or farmers, for example.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. I mean, if you look at whether it be Japan, China, or Korea, but particularly in Japan and Korea, by the late 19th century, some of the most wealthy people in societies were these farmers, farmers who were producing more and more for market and making profit, and merchants who were transporting and trading all of the farm products and so forth. But in society at that time, of course, especially on the Confucian period, they really did not have any strong social standing. They were still considered very low on the social hierarchy scale. So under Protestant Christianity, at least in Korea, where it is exhorting people to make money for the sake of the church, well then for farmers and merchants who become Christian and are making money, it becomes a way for them to gain a new social standing within the church, because they will use their resources and donate it to the church so it will grow. So then what ends up happening is they themselves gain new value. They gain a new identity. and a very important identity amongst the Christian followers. So even if you see today within the Korean Protestant church, you see many wealthy individuals donating money to the church, and for whatever reasons. But what you end up seeing is it gives people legitimacy in some eyes in society today and back then. Legitimacy within the eyes of the followers, that these people are good people and they're contributing to the church, contributing to society. So this whole process of connecting church and capitalism becomes a form of legitimizing many people who are on the outskirts, who are on the outside of Korean society at the time.
And of course, we're well into the Japanese colonial period at this particular point. So how much of this capitalism, I have to assume, was quite attractive, not just to people inside the faith or people considering joining the faith, but to everyone inside the country? Because in some ways, the idea of becoming powerful and economically self-sustaining must have been in some ways a pushback, a way in which they could push back on Japanese colonialism and assert their own, not so much dominance, but authority, a way in which they might be able to solve some of the problems happening inside their country simply through the growth of this Christian-led capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that particularly in the 1890s and the early 1900s, you see a number of prosperous merchants who are Christian, Protestant Christian, creating new schools, like the Osan School, which becomes one of the first schools to train Koreans in modern education so that they'll be these productive workers in societies who can organize and create a strong modern nation state. So you see a lot of Christians taking their resources and investing it in society, and building some type of movement. But I want to be a little careful here. I mean, at the time, you don't see this huge. There is this kind of belief spread, particularly by certain scholars and particularly by churches today, that somehow Korean Christians resisted Japanese colonialism, were always protesting against Japanese colonialism, when in fact that wasn't necessarily the case. Often the case, you had a number of Korean Christian leaders who were very apolitical, who said we shouldn't get involved with political matters, we should only be involved with spiritual matters. You had missionaries, Protestant missionaries at the time, who were very supportive of Japanese colonialism, only because they believed Japan could modernize Korea. So Japan would provide the material benefits, and the Protestant Christian missionaries would provide the spiritual benefits. So it's a nice partnership. So within the Protestant Christian church, you had a number of diverse responses to the rise of colonialism, and certainly by the 1920s and 1930s, you start seeing an even more diverse response to colonialism. And in fact, a lot more Korean Christians becoming far more critical of Japanese colonialism and its connection to capitalism, because they themselves were becoming very critical of industrial capitalism, and starting to believe that Korea should be concerned more about social welfare and should be less concerned about money and so forth. So at the end of the day, there were diverse responses to Japanese colonialism, for sure, by the Protestant church.
So how unified was this movement inside the country at the time? I mean, most of the time when you look around the world and see any religion for a matter, it tends to fragment and have its own infighting. So how was the infighting at the time, if there was any? Because I assume there must have been conservatives and liberals of left and right inside this movement, even if they were, I suppose, closer together than they are now. And I have to assume that they all came together with a similar value that they found within Christianity, the idea of reordering the world around their own daily lives and their own identities for this matter. But there must have been some sort of challenge in just how they incorporate this and how the faith and how the church should function inside Korea.
Yeah, it was very diverse, in fact. The diversity mostly emerges in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. And what ended up happening is as Christianity, Protestant Christianity becomes more mature on the Korean Peninsula, in other words, we're starting to see more Korean Christian leaders taking up leadership positions within the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, and so forth. You start to see them developing their own theologies. So they're not necessarily dependent on the missionaries for theological orientation and theological training. So theological developments really take off in the 1910s and 1920s. And particularly you have one group who works closely with the Protestant missionaries who tend to be more conservative in their thinking about theology and society, where they said, well, the most important thing about Protestant Christianity is converting people and having them in a close relationship with Christ and God, and to cultivate that through prayer and attending church and so forth. So you shouldn't necessarily be concerned about Japanese colonialism. You shouldn't necessarily be concerned about the social problems at the time, which were growing, in fact, poverty, inequality, the problems caused by modernization. Certainly there were a lot of social, economic, and cultural problems. So, but, that group didn't necessarily think that was important. What's most important is about converting. Now, the other group, which tend to be more progressive in their thinking about theology and society, said, well, the most important thing is we have to adopt the identity of the historical Christ who went out and saved people, meaning he attended to people's material needs. So if they were hurt, if they were hungry, Christ provided for them. So therefore, as Christians, we should provide for society. So conversion was not emphasized. What was more emphasized was kind of a social salvation. We should save society. We need to create a better society so that people will be less hungry, there'll be less inequality, and so forth. So you have these competing kind of belief systems starting in the 1910s and all the way up until today in South Korea. And I would say they're intense, the fighting between the various types of groups about theological orientation and relationship to society. And that in the 20s and 30s, it's really compounded because of capitalism is going even more in Korea, which is causing a lot more problems in society, social and economic problems. There's kind of creating all these changes, and Koreans are having a hard time making sense of the changes and living within those changes. And many people on the progressive side said, look, we as a church need to help them. We need to help economically organize them. We need to try to fight inequality. We need to do whatever it takes to help save the bodies of people. And in so doing, we will spiritually nourish them, but we're not going to necessarily need to convert them. That's not the priority of the Christian church.
And there's a last couple of questions here. How fundamental was the visible change to the Korean landscape as a result of this? Because we've been speaking a lot about the pressures and the motivations, not just for capitalism, but for rapid modernization at the time. And of course, we talked about these trade schools and the changes in how people look at money and work and life. But I have to assume that with this would come a dramatic change in the landscape itself. huge significant urbanization, for example. If you're trying to industrialize or modernize, well, people have to move away from farms, move away from traditional land into the larger cities. And families, instead of just having their sons and daughters work the jobs that they did or till on the farm as they did, they'd be saving up and sending these daughters and sons off to universities, off to colleges, off to schools, away from themselves. And so how significant was the visible change that this had on Korea itself?
Well, I think there is significant changes in the intellectual and the physical landscape of Korea during the colonial period, due to colonialism and forces of modernization. As you mentioned, there is some urbanization, but still during that time period, it's still majority rural. Majority of people are living and are peasants and farming. You do, of course, see many more people going to school and so forth, or university and so forth. The real dramatic transformation on the peninsula in terms of physical landscape, as well as intellectual, and maybe the transformation of the religious landscape really happens in the 60s, 70s under the industrial capitalist programs under Park Chung-hee. That's when you have fast-paced urbanization on the Korean Peninsula, just on South Korea part. You also have the literal transformation of cities and the growth of cities, and where people are just moving there left and right to work in textile factories and so forth. And in those cities, they become areas of political change and so forth. So most of the changes that in the landscape happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And at that time, Protestant Christianity, of course, is, again, serving as a force to help mediate and explain those changes and to help organize people. And that's coming from the conservatives as well as the progressives.
And as a final question here, and I know this is a little bit tricky just based on the scope of it, but many people listening to this podcast may have never been to Korea or may not have a particular appreciation of the place that religion still exists inside Korea today. So we've been talking about the rise and the fall of some religions and particularly the rise of Protestant Christianity. So what does the religious landscape look like in Korea today, and particularly how does Christianity fit within that particular landscape?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The one thing that I would say about Protestant Christianity as a religion is that it's a very resilient religion on the peninsula. It's resilient because, one, its message has been very attractive to people within certain historical conditions. And also, it's just sheer power of being an organized religion and being able to disseminate all of its beliefs and practices through schools, hospitals, welfare centers, social welfare centers, print publishing houses, and so forth. And that even continues today. So in South Korea today, Protestant Christianity still has a significant influence in Korean politics, Korean economy, Korean society, where a large number of people, almost 30%, and then if you incorporate the Catholics too, close to 40-50% would identify themselves as Christian. And again, I would say that's because of the attractiveness of the message as well as the organizational power of Christianity, both Catholicism and Protestantism. What you are starting to see more and more is Catholicism become more popular than Protestant Christianity. Protestant Christianity over the years has there's been a number of mega churches that emphasize the prosperity gospel and have been mirrored in scandal, a lot of financial corruption and so forth. So a lot of young people today are turning away from Protestant Christianity. And in Catholicism, they see attractive religion as a vehicle for social change, because there's a lot of social problems in South Korea, a lot of inequality and so forth, and they see Catholicism as a religion of hope. So I would say Catholicism is growing now as more so than Protestant Christianity. And the biggest threat, I think, all religions face here is that simply younger people don't identify themselves as religious anymore, or do not attend any type of religious service or a part of a religious body, whether that be Protestant, Christian, or Buddhist. So that might be one of the biggest threats to religion today. And that's something that all the religions face today is, again, what is kind of asking themselves, what is the value of our religion in a rapidly changing globalized society? What function do we serve? And how do we adapt to that? So those are the big questions facing all religions today here in South Korea.
So that's a good lingering question to leave this podcast on. So below the podcast, I'm going to link the books and articles, all the ones that I used as research for this podcast, and a few others as well of Albert's. We've had to skim across a lot of topics here. There's so much research to be touched on, and we had to skim over a lot of things, which was a shame, but there's only so much we can squeeze into an hour podcast. But I encourage listeners to go and read these things for themselves. There's so much more detail there, and they should get into it as much as they can. On that, Albert Park, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks, Jed. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my work and so forth. Thanks for inviting me.